This episode of the Huddle Breakdown is brought to you in association with the OneFootball app, your one-stop shop for all your football goodness. The OneFootball app is the best football app on the market right now. You can get your fixtures, your results, live scores, transfer news, squad updates, everything that you need on the team that you support is available now in the OneFootball app. The OneFootball app, you can subscribe to the team you support, and all of the stuff that you need on that team is available all in the one spot, and it's all completely free as well. So download the OneFootball app now using the link in the description below. Not only are you supporting the channel, supporting the Huddle Breakdown, you're also getting a top-notch football app as well. So use the link in the description below to download the OneFootball app now. Alrighty, you're welcome along to this week's Huddle Breakdown, episode 5 of season 3, and we're looking back at Celtic's win away to Ross County 3-1 in Dingwall. Kyogo Furuhashi, Moritz Jenz and Abada with the 3 goals for Celtic to give them 2 wins from 2 in the new season. Alan Morrison, Celtic by Numbers, is with me, as is Juco James, as we look back on the game that nobody saw because the SPFL don't know how to market their own game. The stream dropped out for everybody who is watching either legally on Celtic TV or maybe not so legally elsewhere, but we're going to be looking back at this game regardless. Similar sort of format to last week in terms of we're going to be looking at the good stuff, maybe not the great stuff, and some of the things that we need to look at for the games to come. Kilmarnock coming up this Sunday. Alan, we'll start with the good in this, and I'm inclined to start with Moritz Jenz and his debut goal for Celtic, but you can't ignore the 3 goals and who was involved in all 3 goals, and that is Celtic's newish man, as I like to call him this season, and that is Jota. 3 assists for the Portuguese in this game. And again, we're talking about a player here who I mentioned last week in the sense of when things aren't going maybe to plan per se, he has that little bit of spark in him. And that's why Celtic signed Jota this season, because he has the ability to create something out of nothing. And that's what he did a couple of times in this game.
Yeah, he's actually a player whose averages are good, right? Don't get me wrong, they're very good, but not necessarily spectacular. But it's just the sheer volume that he puts into the game in terms of the amount of chances he creates, the number of take-ons he attempts, the number of shots, the number of crosses, etc. He's what you want in a modern winger, in that he's pretty fearless. And you'd say brave on the ball, I would say, in terms of taking people on, not getting discouraged by how the game's going, how the opponents are treating him. He could easily have looked at how Greg Taylor was getting smashed up by that Randall right back every time he went near the ball, and sort of thought, I'm not having any of that. But actually, he wandered over to that side and said, "Yeah, go on then, I'll have a go." And that's his attitude. I think that attitude is something which coaches absolutely love, they absolutely adore. But you've got to be able to produce, and he had a good day. I mean, he didn't have a uniformly good day. It was actually partly down to him that Celtic had that really sloppy piece of possession that led to the corner that we conceded the goal from. That was a lot of that was on him, but he did create 6 chances. He did put 4 balls into the danger zone. 6 of those chances ended up being assists, and so he did. Yeah, and he also had he did end up with the best. No, actually second best packing score. That would have been O'Reilly, but he'd end up with the best sort of expected scoring contribution and sort of attacking threat score in the game. So deserved sort of man of the match for sure. Because and if I was a BBC reporter, I would be saying he dug us out of a hole there.
It was a one-sided affair. Ross County were clearly the better team in this 3-1 victory for Celtic.
Yeah, they were plucky and brave, and Celtic laboured.
Yeah, they pulled it out of nowhere. So did Celtic. Yeah. James, look, you've written about Jota a couple of times. We've had a discussion about Jota a couple of times last season, whether or not he is quote unquote an Ange player or a system player or whatever. But I kind of think that he's a player that, regardless of what system you're playing, he is a player for that system, because he's just so creative in the final third of the game that he can always give him a free ticket from the pressing, which he is actually quite good at. But he is a player that Celtic have bought for his creativity.
Yeah, domestically, there's no question. I mean, he's a man amongst boys, so to speak, in that regard. And against, that level of competition, he understandably and expectedly dominates. So there's value in that, obviously. I mean, to perform as you should when you should is hugely valuable. So I'd be concerned if Jota wasn't dominating against Ross County. That would be the concerning part. So yeah, I mean, and as we've talked about, we knew we were getting to a large degree, and the upside is that he can improve in some of the areas where he's maybe not as tailor-made for the style of play under Ange. But yeah, I mean, the attacking part and the creative part has never been the issue. It's more so, his role in the coordinated pressing, the transitions, which again, I'm like a broken record every week, and it's going to remain that way until we get to September, is, until we face European level competition, those issues really aren't all that big of a deal, because for the most part, the domestic opposition, doesn't present those kind of challenges. So yeah, I mean, he basically has free reign in this kind of game to go berserk, and he did, which is fun to watch.
Yeah, very fun to watch.
Well, if we or watch the replays, I should say.
Well, that's it. Or watch his little boogie after the first goal. I thought I was going crazy. I wasn't sure if that actually happened because I was watching it live on stream. But then I was glad to see somebody else saw it and managed to clip it. So if you haven't seen that, go and search for that on Twitter. It's well worth the watch. Marco is coming in with an early comment, which I do think we will cover in this podcast. Should teams come at Celtic? Fulham went after Liverpool and really outplayed them. And then I know the guys over at 20 Minute Tim's had a conversation about this with, using Brighton against Man United as the proxy for the conversation. We will maybe touch on Ross County's style of play and if it's the most effective way to play against Celtic maybe later on. But just sticking with Jota, Alan, one of the conversations that I suspect will come up over the course of the season if Jota doesn't have his best game is he best played on the right or on the left? Because what we're seeing at the minute is Maeda and Jota, Jota starting on the right, but focusing, he's coming over to the left. The first goal came from him coming in from the left. And I suspect that will be a conversation that we have. Is it more complicated than that? Because, I mean, yeah, sure, naturally you think a winger who is right-footed cutting in on his left side or from the left-hand side onto his right will be more effective that way. But maybe keeping the opposition on his toes by not having a designated position might be the smarter option here for Jota.
Yeah, for sure. So just before I get into that, just something that's caught my eye that's really amused me is on StatsBomb, right? They have a little feature when you go into a player profile, they list similar players, and they have a percentage of similarity between them. So for Jota, the most similar player is Kingsley Coman of Bayern Munich, which is nice. Second is Tom Rogic. Third is Kevin De Bruyne. But it goes on. Fourth is Barry Mackay. Fifth is João Cancelo of Man City. And then sixth is James Tavernier. What is really funny, even more funny, is that there's two James Taverniers on the list, which maybe it's one for each Rangers. I don't know. That's kind of amused me anyway. Anyway, so going back to your question about, Jota, left wing, right wing. So there is a really good article which was on for about 1,000 words on Celtic Way about this very topic today. So have a look at that. It's really good. But the sort of cut down version then for the benefit of our wonderful listeners is that, so I did a study where I just basically, if you look at Jota's career, he's broadly played about 75% of his minutes on the left and 25% on the right. Now, this isn't a very scientifically pure piece of analysis, because I don't, for example, say, here are all your stats for the 10 minutes you played on the right, and here are all your stats for the 80 minutes you played on the left, because I just don't have the time or the bandwidth to do that. And no other site, as far as I'm aware, does that either. So these are broad strokes. You've got to take that into consideration. So if you look at him on the left, actually, what you find is that, well, so first of all, if you look at it as just pure output, right? So goals and assists, it's actually not much of a competition, really. He scores, I think he scored his XG on from the left is 0.38 and his XG on the right is 0.25, so quite a big difference. And his expected assists on the left is 0.53 and on the right is 0.44. Overall. But actually, if you look at all his other metrics, it's actually quite it's actually a little bit interesting when you break it down by position. Essentially, when he comes off the left, it's kind of what you'd expect from a guy who's right-footed playing on the left, in that his expected goals goes up quite a bit because he gets more shots away. He gets more shots away than he does on the right because he's cutting in onto a stronger foot. Similarly, when he's going past a player, especially if he's going on the outside, he's going on his left foot, which is pretty more two-footed than the vast majority of players, but clearly his left side is his slightly weaker side. So the quality of the crosses or the passes he's putting in from that left side are not going to be as high. Then if you look at him off the right-hand side, his XG goes down quite a bit. But then on the other hand, his expected assists goes up quite a bit because, again, he's going past players on his stronger right-hand side, putting in better crosses. And actually he gets, I think, three passes into the danger zone per game on the right side, but only 1.7 on the left side. He creates 3.5 chances per 90 minutes from the right compared to 2.1 from the left. And so his expected assists is actually nearly double from the right, 0.63, than it is from the left, 0.34. Similarly, and perhaps a little bit surprisingly, but again, we can explain that through logic, is that his defensive action success rate is 30% on the right and 25% on the left. And that's because if he's generally playing up against left-footed players on the right, it's much easier for him to block their actions than it is the wrong way on the other side. So actually, if you look at it, if you add up his expected assists and expected goals on each side to give you his expected scoring contribution, from the left, his expected scoring contribution is 0.79, which is pretty good. But on the right, it's actually 0.97. So there is a case to be made for saying he's actually more effective from the right. But it depends what you want. If you want assist Jota, play him on the right. If you want goal threat Jota, play him on the left, which makes perfect sense when you think about the role of a winger and the fact that he's right-footed. And if you invert him, he's going to have these strengths. If he's playing on his natural side, he's going to have different strengths. So it all makes perfect sense, but probably surprises a few people because I think there seems to be this instinctive opinion that he's just better from the left. And actually, the data doesn't support that at all.
Yeah. And I think there's sort of in modern football, especially with the way that analysis has gone, is there seems to be this idea that if you automatically play a player in a position that you think is his strongest position, then automatically he will play better. But that doesn't really work that way because you need 11 players playing exactly how they should, exactly on the day, without taking into account that maybe they just might not have a good game, depending on what's going on in the world or how well their marker plays against them or whatever. It's a complicated business. So for me, it's not as easy to just say, okay, you play Jota on the right because the data backs up that 90%, or I can't remember the exact number, his scoring contribution is better on the right. Because if he plays on the right against a better defender, or if he plays on the right and he has a bad game, then that can go down and you can change the data over to say, okay, well, he's actually better off the left.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, yeah, and I agree with that. And as I say, this wasn't perfect, and the amount of data from him playing on the right was more than 10 games worth, but still quite small sample. But his point is he's pretty productive on either side. And the good news for Celtic is that really you can play him on either side, and if it's not working on one side, perfectly adequate to switch him over to the other side, and the probability is he'll be very productive on one or the other at least. So no issue, but just interesting that the perception, as I say, might be a little bit different from what the data is telling us.
Yeah, shall we talk about Moritz Jenz? The defender came in for his league debut for Celtic because Stephen Welsh had picked up either a knock or a virus or something during the week.
It was a virus, I believe, yeah.
Virus, yeah. So he wasn't fully fit for this game or fully ready. So Moritz Jenz came in for his league debut for Celtic. Pretty solid from what I've seen before the game. Obviously collapsed on TV. Got his goal. Very strong header from a towering centre-back. Nice to see that once again in a Celtic shirt. Something that we've been sort of missing over the last couple of years. James, your thoughts on Jenz and how he performed? I know, again, we're talking about Ross County here, who didn't exactly come out all guns blazing against Celtic, but in terms of his general contribution to even the attacking play from Celtic.
Yeah, I think he's been fine. I think it's such a lazy, and I'm going to do it. So I'm not accusing anyone else of doing the same thing.
We're all about lazy analysis here.
Yeah, it's a lazy comparison to compare him to Julian for the multitude of reasons. But there are some significant parallels in the sense that his appetite for range of passing seems to be fairly robust, meaning that he's willing to take risks. He's willing to try, kind of long switched balls and some of these, more aggressive passing. So that's very different than Starfelt. Starfelt, for the most part, is very safe, and efficient in that way. I mean, he does not give the ball away. Jenz seems to be quite aggressive, but not really great at it over a long sample that I've looked at. So there's going to be some volatility to that sometime, so what I'm getting at is it kind of lends itself to confirmation bias, right? When they come off, people that, are positively disposed towards them are going to say, look, point that one out and say, look, he's great at it. And then when he doesn't, when it doesn't come off, the people that are predisposed against them are going to kind of refer to that. So, again, this is not the kind of game that's going to dramatically stress our center backs. He was fine on the ball. He, as we talked about when we signed him, he brings an element in attack and set pieces that we haven't had, or we didn't have last season. And he certainly showed that in the goal that he scored, which I think is a positive, meaning that he has a specific thing that he's quite good at that can be helpful and add a dimension that we don't currently have. But I don't see him as the one that's going to kind of bring this ball playing center back dimension to Celtic. But I think he looks like he's functional in the same level that Starfelt and CCV are in playing that kind of not ball playing center half role at a European level. So that depth is good. I'll be curious to see whether or not, if he's fit, Welsh kind of steps back in, or what the dynamics are relative to Starfelt resuming his starting place. That competition and depth is good. But as we've talked about recently, so far, the only one that looks like even theoretically they have the potential to be that ball playing center back would be Welsh. Admitting that he's not the ideal one given his right-footedness, and he still needs to improve, but he's of an age that plausibly can still happen. So mostly good, but again, not the game that we're going to get stress tested for his role. They didn't really push us on playing the high line that much. Their transitions weren't very good. Now, again, we imposed a lot of that. But from what I saw, again, I didn't see all of the game. But the parts that I did see, they didn't stress test us in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Again, I don't want to go in too deep into this conversation because I'm going off Wikipedia stats, but according to Wikipedia, he is 1.9 meters, which translates to 6'2", which would make him considerably our biggest centre back, and he looks at it in the pitch as well. Like the Julian comparison is sort of lazy, but I honestly genuinely thought I was watching Julian at times because he looks like Julian on the pitch with just the stature and his build and the way he carries himself. It's very similar to Julian.
Well, I mean, I did, and I'm glad James called me lazy because I did a piece that actually showed his stats playing for Lorient, and Julian's stats playing for Toulouse were almost identical. They were almost identical. They both played in a team that finished 15th or 16th in Liga and nearly got relegated, and almost had identical number of points, identical goal difference, and their performance data was almost identical as well. It was
sometimes lazy works, Alan. That's how I've lived my life.
But no,
ask my wife.
So I just reported that. I don't want to compare him to Julian because he's a much younger player, but I hope he's a bit quicker. But I was kind of actually encouraged the fact that Julian turned out to be a lot more composed on the ball than I had gathered from his equivalent stats at the time, and therefore I was hoping that the 30 minutes against Norwich and then those data points would suggest he would be. Listen, he gave the ball away quite a lot, as James said. I thought it was a mixed performance. I'll be honest, right? there was clearly some good in there. There was some nice passing. You know, he I think he was 87% pass completion. I know that sounds a lot, but it's actually really low for a centre back. So Carter Vickers would be 97%, for example. You know, he lost a couple of headed duels. Now, listen, the wind actually, unusually for a professional football match, the wind had a massive impact on that game. You saw it in the first half when any sort of clearance meant Celtic were having to retrieve the ball from the opposite stand and start with Joe Hart. You just had to get anything on the ball and it just flew to the other end of the pitch. And then, of course, the number of any air on the ball forward, and the ball was just going all over the place. So it was just a very difficult game to judge people in that respect. His goal was clearly nice, wind assisted, bulleted into the corner, into the top of the net. But you know, he made a couple of bad mistakes. He lost his player for the goal as well. So it was kind of a mixed performance. And like James, I'm fascinated to know at Kilmarnock whether Welsh gets back in, or Starfelt, or Jenz keeps his place. My money, for what it's worth, is that, you know, Postecoglou, providing the player in possession of the shirt, hasn't, you know, embarrassed themselves. He's got the shirt until he loses it, would be my reading, but I might be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, we shall wait and see on that front. I mean, the issue is that our centre backs aren't really being tested in these games too much, so it's hard to really tell, bar the processional play, how these.
Yes and no. I mean, there's not being tested and still, you know, being at fault for a goal in a couple of dodgy areas. And there's not being tested and being absolutely immaculate, like Carter Vickers, who was just like immaculate. You know, he just, you know, and that was one of the pluses for me, was quietly and efficiently, he's just really, really effective. And he doesn't make a big fuss about it. He just gets on with it. And I don't think people realise how effective he is.
Yeah. I'm going to be really annoying and say that it was his first game, so we'll just give the boy a little bit of time to see. Yeah,
10 games, another 9 games. Yeah.
One last thing to finish up on before we move on to what could have improved in this game. The substitution situation is quite interesting with Celtic, given the staffness of the squad at the minute. Even though there are potentially a couple of names to come in, as we'll touch on before we finish up on the pod. But Liel Abada is someone that hasn't been in the starting lineup so much this season, even though we're 2 games in, but, you know, pre-season included. But he came on and he scored an amazing goal in this game. And interesting to get your thoughts on him and where he stands in the team this year, because, you know, there is that age-old argument of, okay, a guy is coming off the bench, he's been really effective here, he deserves to start. But then another way to look at that is that this guy's really effective off the bench. Maybe we should keep him on the bench and take him on when the opposition are a little bit tired. So, James, I'll throw that question to you. Liel Abada, is he a starter, or is he a guy who comes on to maybe tear the life out of an already beaten or tired opposition?
I think there's ample room for him to do both. And I think that relative to a lot of domestic opposition, I'm actually gravitating towards the idea of him starting over Maeda, let's say. And then in Europe, I would say I would probably flip that. And I just wrote a piece on him. So this is all fresh of mind. I just finished doing all the analysis Monday and Tuesday. And so I think Abada is a wonderfully complicated player from an analytics perspective. And I think that his sort of profile lends itself to some of the more, let's say, the newer models that offer some insight into methodology to balance out, because he does a lot of things well. He does a couple of things really well, and then he's actually quite bad in ways that you would normally view as being severely detrimental to a winger playing at Celtic. So let me talk about this. So he gives the ball away at a pretty high rate relative to how often he passes, for example. So his turnover rate, let's say, you know, so when he tries stuff, you know, there's at a pretty high rate, it doesn't work. but when it does work, it's actually really good. So he's very good at creating chances. When it does come off, they tend to be extremely good chances for his teammates. He's not great at beating opposition players one-on-one and dribbling, right? You would think a Celtic winger would be really good at bypassing opposition fullbacks, that kind of thing. So it's those kind of things where he kind of stacks up. He gets dispossessed quite a bit, even when he's carrying the ball. So again, very different than what Jota is. Jota is kind of really good at all of those things, whereas Abada's got a lot more unevenness to how he performs. But if you kind of net all this stuff out, he doesn't quite get to the level of Jota, but his attacking, and we've talked about this endlessly, Alan and I, about how good he is in the box, and he's kind of got that instinct of getting in position, almost like that striker's instinct inside 12 yards. And his finishing at times has been quite good. So I think when you kind of net all this out, it kind of like what I said with Jenz, it's easy to fall into confirmation bias with him because there's going to be a lot of things he does that's ugly, right? He's going to make some just stunningly bad decisions at times and really bad passes where it seems almost like what were you thinking, how could you try that, or that kind of thing. And then on the flip side of that, he's so brilliant, like on that finish on the weekend, that it's easy to kind of have the bias towards him. So this is where I think some of the new metrics that are out to help balance this out, I think it firmly balances out positive for him. And I think that the profile of that lends itself domestically in particular. I think that the positives get less positive when we go up against higher level opposition. And Maeda is almost the flip of that, meaning that where Maeda really adds value is in counter pressing, some of his runs and finishing. And when we're facing these kind of compressed mid blocks to low blocks, I think a lot of his value kind of gets diluted in those kind of games because we're just not doing that much of that. There's just not that much for him to do. And, he's not great on the ball as far as creativity or beating men one-on-one. He's got a lot of the same deficiencies as Abada in that regard without some of the similar upside that Abada brings. So that's kind of how I've come around to it. I threw my hands up in my article. I was one of the early skeptics on Abada. And I think that's part of building a robust analytical process is to try and check your own biases. And I think, some of these new tools that I've been, diving into over the last year have helped me kind of come around, get my head around, okay, my own biases are gravitating towards all the stuff he's been doing wrong and not properly weighting the value that he's adding when he does do things right. And there could be spectacular when he does them.
What's funny about this is the age-old perception conversation that we talk about, because if you close your eyes and I listened to what you were saying there, I almost would have thought you were talking about James Forrest, except Celtic fans have had 12 years of James Forrest and the bad things that he does. And I don't think a lot of people give James Forrest credit for all the good things that he has done as well. So it'll be interesting to see now if Celtic manage to hold on to Abada for the next 3-4 years, which is, maybe unlikely, if people still have the same perception as they do now, because I think he still sort of gets away with, he's a young developing player, so people are more willing to give him a little bit more slack for losing the ball. But I think, again, when he's scoring goals like he did at the weekend, it becomes much easier to do that.
Well, losing the ball, this is getting kind of the asymmetry, right? So in a traditional statistical, counting stats perspective, you look at cross rate, his crossing rate's really not very good compared to other players, for example, like Jota or, even Greg Taylor, Juranovic, those kind of guys historically, and again, depending on the sample size. But when they come off, he's putting in such good balls that it's looking at the value, the leverage, let's say, of those individual deliveries, right? So it's those raw counting stats that can be deceptive for players like Abada, I think, because when it does come off, it's so good. So it's not like this linear relationship across players. Ralston's been like that too. So Ralston, in many regards, has been incredibly effective when it comes off, even though his kind of hit rate, shall we say, isn't as high as it could be.
Oh, and you wanted to come in on that, did you?
Oh, just a few things. I mean, I find Abada to be a bit of an enigma for people. His underlying data is actually quite spectacular. Okay. Now, James is alluding to probably some stats bomb, especially the OBV stats, which I'm still trying to wrestle my head around how they actually work them out. And therefore, I'm not going to sort of poo-poo that. But looking at more sort of traditional advanced stats, his expected scoring contribution is actually just a little bit higher than Jota's. I'm talking about last season, okay? I mean, which is he gives the ball away in the final third less than Jota, O'Reilly, and Rogic, okay? Now, again, you might argue, well, that he's not got the ball as much. They're all players that probably get possession a little bit more. That's fair enough. Even on crossing, I mean, Jota's an outlier, right? I mean, Jota's way ahead of anyone else in the squad for cross success, okay? But, you know, Abada's would be about the same as Juranovic, but less than Ralston and O'Reilly. So, yeah, he's not fantastic at crossing, but he's probably about fourth or fifth best in the squad. So I think there's an awful lot, and he's a young. We keep saying he's a young kid, so I think there's an awful lot more to come from him. If he was starting, I'd be happy with that. If he's coming off the bench, I'd be happy with that. So I don't have an issue either way. But I do think he's a lot. His performance data is a lot stronger than the perception he seems to leave people with. And I think James has, done a good job of probably explaining why some of that happens.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, like I said, he's a young player, so I'm more than willing to give him ample opportunity to improve, and he's on a very high trajectory at the minute. So, I mean, if he he doesn't start, I think he's going to make an impact on Celtic's season, as many of Celtic's players off the bench have done. Like we've spoken about with the Matt O'Reilly quotes from a couple of weeks ago, it's not so much people are on the bench, it's that people are fighting for their starting position and hoping that, you know, they can push on and get into the starting 11. And we do want to talk about Alex Collado, because he's going to be a player that potentially could be in the hoops this season. And I think it's a sort of a link that has come out of nowhere, the Barcelona youngster. But we'll talk about him near the end. Just before we finish up with the Ross County game, the conversation that was mentioned in the comments about the way that Ross County played against Celtic. And this is a conversation I think the guys over 20 Minute Tims had on their podcast as well. And that was about the way that teams set up against Celtic and whether or not it's the best way to do so. I mean, I'm sort of struck with this. I'm not sure how I fully feel about it, because the wage gap disparity and the structure disparity of the clubs, like if you compare Celtic and Rangers to the other clubs in the SPFL, even the bigger ones like Hearts and Hibs, it's still night and day. It's like they're playing in completely different stratospheres, and money-wise, player-wise, structure-wise, they're completely different clubs. But whether or not parking the bus and playing defensive football and not pressing and not trying to attack all that much is the best way to play against a team like Celtic is very hard to know. So, I mean, interesting to get your thoughts on this, Alan, because I guess you've probably got the most mileage of SPFL watching on this pod, not to call you old in any sort of way. You've been watching the game longer than I've been watching it.
What did I do to deserve that?
Like, is there like, there's an argument to say that in the Premier League this year there's no quote unquote long ball team. They're all teams that play football, and you're looking at teams like, you know, Fulham playing against Liverpool in the first game of the season last week, really went out and attacked them and played balls out from the back and a bit of slow build up and pressed high and were brave in many ways and got success from that. I'm not so sure that works in the SPFL, where the disparity is so big between Celtic and a team like Ross County. I'm not sure if Ross County come out and press the hell out of Celtic, they have the structures of the players to do so, that they wouldn't be carved open within 30 minutes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even Fulham have got, you know, in relative terms, very good footballers that are very expensive and are probably
Fulham will get relegated this year by finishing last and will get paid 60 odd million more than Celtic will get for winning the SPFL for doing so.
Yeah, depressing, but true. So it's interesting you were saying in terms of long teams playing long ball. So actually, so far, only 2 games into the season. So I do track this stuff as well. So Celtic have played. They've had 38 successful long balls according to FOTMob. The highest in the league would be Dundee United at 80. So looking at this, actually, Dundee United are the team that attempts the most number of long balls. And even the Rangers are significantly more long ball orientated than Celtic are. In fact, they're closer to sort of Hearts, and Livingston are sort of are in the same kind of ballpark. To me, most of the teams in the SPFL are long ball teams, actually. But by the way, I would reckon it in terms of long direct passes. So that seems to be the norm, sadly, in terms of the way teams play. Is it the best way to play against Celtic? Well, you probably, if you try and play through a high press and you're successful, then there's a high upside to that because of you're going to catch your opponent out, high up the pitch, etc. But so far, not many teams have been able to do that. Now, it will be interesting to see what happens on Saturday, the game, or Sunday against Kilmarnock? Sunday, is it? Okay, yeah. Sunday against Kilmarnock, because it's a McInnes team, so he'll probably go man for man, and he may well try and press a lot higher than what on the plastic pitch than what Ross County with their kind of slightly odd. They sort of sat back quite deep, apart from the front three, who seemed a little bit disconnected to me to the rest of the team. But there's a bit of a gap there. But they were pretty tight once you got to the defensive third, and then Aberdeen had a kind of mid block where they didn't press very much. So subtleties are there already from what we've seen. I think Kilmarnock will be different again. I think it'll be more man-on-man orientated. I think they'll probably gamble on a press a little bit more. I've not seen them this season, so I might be completely wrong. I'm just guessing by the way that McInnes usually sets his teams up when he plays Celtic. But to come back, coming back to your question, I think there's already differences in how teams in the SPFL set up to play against Celtic. In terms of what is the optimal, it really depends on what players you've got and what your own strengths are, really. I think the one team that I'm thinking back over the last, say, 6 or 7 years maybe, that's come out and tried to play Celtic has probably been Hibs. When they were under Lennon and maybe a couple of other managers, they actually tried to come and play. And it generally led to quite high scoring, entertaining games. And Hibs actually got a bit of success, especially at home. There was a few draws, etc. And they scored a few goals at Celtic Park, but they also conceded quite a few on occasion. So, listen, it's horses for courses. It really is. There's no right way. It's a rock scissors paper, as I keep saying in many respects. It may not be a very satisfactory answer, but unless you've got the personnel to play a certain way, then that's really going to dictate what the most effective counter method to play Celtic is. But what Celtic will set out to do is press you relentlessly, attack you at pace, have a lot of movement off the ball, trying to have overloads in the half spaces and in the on both sides, and challenge you to counter it. And I think what we've seen over 32, 33 games now is that teams can be successful to a point, like Ross County were, but eventually, and I think the 5 sub rule really does play into the hands of the top 2, unfortunately, because it just means they've got 5 more relatively expensive players they can bring on to reinforce when the other team are getting tired, and that's a huge advantage to have over the less well-resourced teams. So you just keep doing plan A, and then you bring on fresher legs. You can replace half your team to go again at plan A with fresher legs and pretty much the same standard of player. So, Celtic, I think Celtic are going to get a lot of late goals this season, and that's why I was not really worried, other than for the fact I couldn't bloody see what was going on.
Yeah, I think it's too complicated of an issue to say parking the bus works or it doesn't work. I think it's like
it works if you get a good result, and you could
exactly
from that perspective.
From the opposition perspective, it's almost like, okay, do we write off these games against Celtic and Rangers, and do we just go as hard as possible against the opposition that we have a chance against? And maybe that is the best way of going about it. But I'm going to use an analogy that a lot of the listeners may not understand, including the two of you, because it's an Irish-based one. But in GAA, a couple of years ago, it was 2012. Donegal, where I'm from, they had a manager called Jim McGuinness. He was actually a coach at Celtic. A lot of people might know. He was a coach under Ronnie Dyla, and he came up with this system of defensive GAA football. But the first year it was purely based upon defensive stability, closing down the opposition. It was putrid to watch, horrible to watch, incredibly effective, but horrible to watch because they didn't attack. They just defended for the entirety of the game. They got to the semi-final of the major competition. The following year, 2012, they went from this defensive system to suddenly now, after defending, they spring a massive counterattack. And they were the highest scorers in the season. They had the highest scorers in terms of the forwards, they were all top of the list of the top scorers. But then after that, you see copycat systems of teams that do not have the same players as Donegal had, doing bad versions of this system, and suddenly now people are blaming Donegal for inventing defensive football. But Donegal were very effective in terms of what they did. So I think that's my major issue with this, is that the teams that are playing against Celtic are focused so much on the defensive element that they're forgetting that they kind of have to attack at some point in this game. Otherwise, Celtic will eventually break them down and score more goals than them. So I think there is a development in Scotland that needs to happen of these defensive systems being in place because of the disparity. They have to be in place, but they need to figure out a way of counterattacking against Celtic when, Celtic are probably most vulnerable from the counterattacks, and maybe that is the best way to play against them.
Yeah, so from a purely an analytics perspective, I think of this in terms of optimization, right? So I think a good recent example of this, and it relates, kind of dovetails with your example from the GAA, and is Barnsley and what they did in the championship a couple of years ago, when John Muller, who's a football journalist, fellow American, I think he's writing for The Athletic now. He was doing a Substack, or the equivalent, I don't know, WordPress or whatever, his own newsletter at that time. And he coined the phrase skyball, because what Barnsley was doing was this very, extreme version of long ball, and having recruited players specifically designed to try and optimize this strategy. And they went from, Barnsley to being on the cusp of getting promoted into the Premier League. And they ended up walking back from that strategy because it was so ugly, and their support were, despite the relative success of the strategy, were up in arms, hating it because it was, an eyesore to watch. And they were having issues in selling players because people within the industry, again, the industry is still quite antiquated from an analytics perspective. They're moving forward, but they're still antiquated overall. So the market hasn't developed yet for this kind of optimization strategy, right? So there's a question of optimizing your club, and playing style relative to, let's say, Barnsley in the situation they were in, which is, even within the championship, this kind of budget, the Ross County of that kind of league, or Livingston. And then there's, how do you optimize in specific games? How do you game plan for this opponent, optimization for this matchup, and Europe versus domestic? All of these different things are all questions of optimization. And how do you optimize not only tactics, but players relative to those tactics, relative to the opponent? Again, all this stuff sounds pretty simple. My view is, in watching Scottish football, is that there aren't a lot of teams that do it very well. They're really bad at it, actually. So it'll be interesting to watch what McInnes does, because, I think Polworth and Alan Power and Liam Donnelly have been playing their kind of defensive midfield. So
that's a slow midfield.
Right. So the idea that they're going to man mark against Celtic in a game is patently ridiculous. Doesn't mean he's not going to do it. I've seen enough over the years from him that, and in the grand scheme of the league and of the nation's leagues in Scotland, I think he's considered at least a decent manager. He's not considered a completely terrible manager. And yet I watch what he does, and it's like you can't even begin to put together a reasonable conversation about optimization. So, I think that I've been saying this since last year, particularly with the style of play that Ange deploys, is that for most teams, bunkering makes the most sense, particularly narrow bunkering, if they don't have the coaching and the athleticism to be able to press, right? If they have the athleticism and they have the coaching to get the players to do it in a coordinated way, even if they don't have the attacking deficiency, I think trying it early, trying to get that goal early, whether it's a set piece or an error or a mistake that you cause because of the pressing, kind of go balls to the wall for the first 10, 15 minutes, try to get that early goal, then you bunker. Like, that's how I would be thinking about it. If I was an opposition club going up against Celtic, because you're trying to get variance in your favor. And you got to do it in small bunches, because to your point, Enda, if they do it over any length of time, if they open up for any length of time, I think they slide the probabilities heavily towards Celtic, because we're just going to rip them apart, and the disparity in quality is so significant. And the analogy with the Premier League is not a great one, I think, because it's orders of magnitude, right? Ross County is like 1/15 or 1/20th of the financial resource, and you can't look at transfer spending. It's wages that matter. Transfer spend is like the incremental value of speakers. I've used this analogy before, right? The difference in quality between a $5,000 speaker and a $500,000 speaker is like, this much. It's very, very, very slight. Now that matters at the highest levels, but the difference between Brighton or Fulham or Leicester, or as you go up through the budget scale in the Premier League, the orders of magnitude are just dramatic relative to what's going on in Scotland. So,
but there are learnings. I mean, I think what I've taken from what you've said there, James, is that like Barnsley, like Livingston, like Brighton, like Brentford, the way that you do this to counteract having a huge differential in wages and capabilities is you have a good plan, or you have a plan. You have a plan, and you implement it as well as you can.
Optimize, exactly.
And optimize recruitment for it. So that doesn't necessarily mean buying the best players. It means buying the best players within the budget for the plan and the style of play that you've got. That's what Barnsley did, and they got success doing it. Mm-hmm. That's what Livingston have done for a number of seasons. They've bought players to play in a specific way, and the way that they want to play, or not they want to play, the way that they can play, which is effective. It means they can attract players within their budget, and that makes absolutely perfect sense. And they've massively overachieved. Brighton, the same. They have a very distinct way they want to play, and that's the way they implement. So my advice to all, not that anybody wants to listen to me, but the advice should be, as I say, have a plan and implement it well. It's really that simple. I say it's that simple. If it was that simple, lots of teams would do it, and very few do. And that tells you a lot about the industry, actually.
And we've talked about this a little bit in the past. Is on the margins, I think Livingston is one of the better clubs in doing that, meaning that they've to at least a reasonable degree optimized their playing style, their recruitment, and their players to the fact that they play half of their games in the macaroni, right? So that a club in their situation getting kind of locked down sustainability in the Premiership is a huge deal, and they've effectively accomplished that. They haven't really been under threat of any significance in going down. They haven't really been in even a relegation fight late in the season in quite some time now. And I think that's a testament to the fact that they've done a decent job. I was joking on Twitter when they played the first game against Rangers, that Celtic should be signing that new striker of theirs. And it's a good example. Like, this guy clearly. He was on loan, I think, at like Arbroath or something last season. Like, and he's not like young, he's not 19 or 20, but his skill set is custom made playing in, that side in that stadium. Is that going to fit when he comes to Celtic Park to play, or even at Ibrox? No, it's going to be a completely different situation. But So I think there's a lot of, and I was critical, the guy just got fired, so I don't want to speak too badly of him because I don't like anyone getting fired. But, Graham Alexander, I said that last season where Motherwell would play Celtic and they'd come in playing us like they were trying to play against, anybody in the league. And it's like, it's just ridiculous. Like, not playing tight, not playing narrow, trying to go out and press in certain ways. And it's like, your players just are not athletic enough and good enough and coordinated enough to be able to do that. And we would routinely shred his teams and rip them apart as a result. So, I think there's just a lack of flexibility in these optimization ideas amongst a lot of the clubs. So, we'll see if there are any other ones that continue to improve like Livingston have.
Just a final point on this, and I think you make a good point on that, is that I do feel like there is sort of a general laziness about the style of play, not in the sense, like I completely understand why they're doing it, but I'm just like, can you not think of anything else to do in the long term that would serve you better than just getting a manager who's going to park the bus? Can you not do like you guys are saying? Think of a plan. Think of some way that we could get an advantage, bring in smart people to implement these plans, and over the long term, develop it and see where that brings you rather than just, it strikes me, do you know the scene in Moneyball where you've got the directors and the scouts and everyone in the one room and they're talking about the players and the players they're going to bring in, and the guys who have spent their careers in baseball are, who are you? Like, how have you haven't spent enough time in baseball to understand what's going on? It kind of feels like that football is sort of still, especially Scottish football, is still sort of in that sphere of thinking that, okay, this is how it's always been done. This is how we've got success in the past, success being not getting relegated or surviving in the league, or whereas they can't really see the overall plan of maybe we will progress further than just surviving and compete with Hibs and Hearts for the third and fourth best team in Scotland if we put a plan in place. And I think that's my biggest issue with what is going on.
Yeah, Scottish football is a deeply conservative environment. Most football environments actually are deeply conservative and very distrusting of people that aren't sort of been in the industry for a long time, and that's just the way it is. It's culturally, it's very narrow in that sense. If you remember, I remember when Clive Woodward went to work for Southampton, and he wasn't given a chance, and you can imagine the hostility he was treated. I mean, this guy has got so much to give in terms of, ideas about how to sweat tiny margins to improve over all facets of the game, whether it's psychological, physical, mental. Not just that he wasn't going to go in there and tell Southampton how to play football. He was going to go in there and tell them how organisationally they could be better, how mentally they could be better, etc. And I wouldn't listen. The last thing I would do is start beating up on clubs like Ross County and Livingston, because actually they're to me they're incredibly well run football clubs. The ones I would be critical of are your Hearts, your Hibs, Aberdeen, who've all gone through changes of ownership recently and should be have had opportunities to modernise. If you've got a budget the size of Hibs and Hearts, Aberdeen, if you're smart, you should be able to put a good football team on the pitch. I mean, just look at how some of these Scandinavian teams are playing. They are no bigger than those clubs, right? Bodo Glimt are not bigger than Hibs. Midtjylland are not bigger than Aberdeen, right? There's no excuse why you shouldn't be able to go. At Brighton, when they were in the lower leagues, were much smaller than the three clubs I've just mentioned. So they're the clubs that I think that should be, that I'm disappointed in, that haven't innovated yet and haven't, improved in that regard.
Yeah, I think
just a final point on that. Sorry, James, to cut across. The owner of Barnsley, Paul Conway, he actually said last year or the year before that if he was allowed to, there's rules in place that he can't own two British clubs. If he was allowed to, he'd be able to break the Celtic Rangers stranglehold off the SPFL in a couple of years, which is it's a ballsy call, but there's no saying that, Alex Ferguson did it before with Aberdeen. There's no saying that it can't be done again.
Yeah, Alex Ferguson did it, Jim McLean did it. So different days, I know, different times, etc. But absolutely, that attitude is what's needed.
Absolutely, and it would take a fulsome adoption of analytics, but also this idea of optimization. And I think one of the main stumbling blocks that still remains, as far again as an outsider, that I've been able to ascertain, is that there's still this culture, and again, it's not just in Scotland. I think, to Alan's point, it does seem to be more of an industry-wide issue, is treating the players as dumb footballers, right? And if you look at, and again, I have a lot of experience with North American sports, obviously, they are now treated as almost like academic students. Professional NFL football players, NBA players. I mean, these guys are spending significant amounts of time in the classroom, going over what's going on and optimization, basically. Like, how do we change our game plan? I mean, there are, the great New England Patriot teams were infamous for this, is that they would come in every week with a completely new game plan for every single opposition that was optimized for that specific opponent. And that happened, at that time, 16 games a year in regular season. And this was during the golden era when they were, in the Super Bowl so much and going on this huge run. And that's emblematic of, and even if I remember listening to Tierney on one of his interviews after he'd gone to Arsenal and commenting on the disparity in the work that he was getting and having to study and the amount of information that was coming out of the club that they had to go over and learn. And I think that's part of this issue of optimization, like to just do it abstractly. I mean, that's where you end up with man-to-man marking with Liam Donnelly and Alan Powers, right? It's got to be informed optimization, and you've got to have players that are able to make decisions and do things on the fly. Because so this goes back to these issues of how do we get Celtic to play in certain ways in different forums, and how do we optimize in Europe relative to domestically, and you got to be able to have players that can think and do things with the best information. And that's where I think, as an industry, it's still, the expectations are still real low for players, I think, in a lot of countries, and particularly lower league levels, where they're just, thought to go out and play. And that's fine, but that's not where the innovation is taking things.
Yeah, I mean, during the American theme, even the Chicago Bulls, you think, well, they won because they had Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, two of the greatest players to ever play the game. Well, yeah, that helped, but actually they won because Michael Jordan didn't win an NBA title till he was 30 years old, and the reason for that was because they didn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan how to use him properly, and it wasn't until they used him properly within a structure, with a style of play. They had the best coach and the best analyst guy working out the best way for the players to play. And only when they put that in place did they start to win, even though they had they had Michael Jordan. So you've got to have all those components. And just because you've got the best players, you won't win if you're not organized optimally.
I think we'll park this conversation for another time because we're a little bit over time here. But just to finish off, one link for Celtic in the transfer market this week, and it's a very interesting one. It's Alex Collado, Barcelona youngster. He was on loan with Granada last season, and he seems to be a bit of a Jota here, Alan.
So listen, this isn't me being clever, right? You can go onto website FBref, look up Alex Collado, and there's a bunch of stats bomb data that they put publicly available. There's tons of it on this kid. So this is not me, sharing this tricks of the trade here. We're going self-help here, right? His stats are actually incredible because and this is bear in mind, this is where you have to be so careful with stats, and we always talk about context because he played for Granada, right? Granada got relegated. He played 17 games in a poor side where he wasn't doing a lot of attacking. If you look at his attacking stats, they're all in the sort of 30th, 40th, and lower quartiles. He just looks terrible. And then you look at his defensive stats, and they're mind-blowing. I mean, for a winger, he's in the 95 to 99th percentile for tackles, for in all parts of the field, for pressures, for blocks, for interceptions. it's just incredible. It's just like he looks like a. If you imagine, Vinnie Jones on speed, it looks like that. It looks like that. You sort of think, well, it's never a winger. So it's absolutely fascinating stats, but clearly you have to take these and contextualize them very, very carefully, because clearly, he's been playing in a very poor team, and he might be being used in a certain way. But yeah, certainly a fascinating looking player. I'm not going to get, again, I don't tend to do this, right? Just because someone on Twitter says we're in for this player, and until they actually sign, I'm not getting too carried away. But I did think his stats profile was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So is this a sort of a competition signing here, James, for the likes of I don't know, O'Reilly, Maeda, Jota? This kid seems to be somebody who could play in a multitude of positions, which I guess is what we're looking for.
Yeah, as I had a dog eruption behind me here. Apologies. I think if it depends if we don't sign another defensive mid, right? So I guess the depth that we have in midfield, I think, is probably not as good as we would hope. Again, given the Moy signing, and we're not really sure about him. I say we, and I think I shouldn't say we. I'm not really sure about his role. I mean, he's been playing more of as an 8, and I just don't see him as a European level 8 at this stage. So, unless we're going to sign another 6 and move McGregor forward, we're basically one injury away from those key 3 8s where the depth is gone, and I think that's really the issue. And I don't know if this guy's an 8. He's played some stuff, on the wing a little bit. And again, I haven't dug into him a lot, but so I think, and the fact that he has some flexibility would be helpful if he does have the ability to play off the right or play as an 8, as an attacking 8. So, I mean, obviously the pedigree is there. It's kind of like, I think it was Michoud, the guy from PSG. He seems to be kind of that strata. And he's still, he's a little older than I would like at 23, but it's still young enough. So, that it's more in the neighborhood of the kind of signing that gets me excited, like Michoud would have. But yeah, I mean, bring it on. That's what I say.
Yeah, well, hopefully he will be somebody who comes in the door, and it's not Ross Barkley, who's also being linked with the Celtic. So I can't see that happening. So we're not even going to discuss the potential of that on today's show, because we've already done just over an hour. Kilmarnock coming up this Sunday, as we mentioned. We will discuss that in full on next week's show. But before we finish up, guys, anything you just want to touch on?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Oh, sweet. We shall chat to everybody on the flip side, as they say in America. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching. And we'll chat to you next week after hopefully another win against Kilmarnock this weekend to make it 3 from 3. We'll chat to you later. Good luck.